you so much, Diana. And yes, please sign up for that plant-based diet lecture. It's a 2-hour workshop, and we do go into all kinds of things about what it means to do a plant-based diet. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Sean Hashmi is a practicing nephrologist and obesity medicine specialist in Southern California, Kaiser Permanente, currently serving as the regional director for clinical nutrition and weight management at Southern California Kaiser. He's a practicing nephrologist over at Woodland Hills, and in his role as regional director for clinical nutrition and weight management, he's responsible for developing a comprehensive obesity management strategy, which involves lifestyle medicine and obesity medicine for all the members of Southern California. He's driven by a lifelong commitment in his service to others. He also has an evidence-based health, nutrition, and wellness research 501c3 nonprofit called selfprinciple.org. So please check that out. And I will turn this over to Dr. Sean Hashmi. Thank you so much for being here.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for having me. First, real quickly, you can see my screen okay, and you can hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get started. So I wanted to make this a fun little thing for you guys. So I'm going to give you 3 actual topics, and depending on how we do with time, what I would ask is any questions you have, just put it in the chat and I'll be sure to answer them as we sort of get to the end of this. So the first one is going to be plant-based diet versus keto. Then we're going to talk about Mediterranean versus plant-based, and then we'll give you some basic qualities that you need to understand on picking whatever diet you decide to do in life, so you can have all sorts of ideas that you can walk away with. So with that, let's dive into the first topic, which is plant-based diet versus keto. So understanding ketogenic diet is really confusing. Most people assume they know what a ketogenic diet is, but there's actually lots and lots of definitions. So the classic ketogenic is a 4:1 ratio. That's a fat to protein to carbohydrate ratio. Most people have a really, really hard time trying to do the classic ketogenic diet. That's why there's variance. Some of those variants are things like the 3:1 ratio, where essentially you're going a little bit lower on the fat portion of it. Then there's the modified Atkins, or what I call the MAD diet, which is what they use in children a lot because the classic keto is so hard for kids to do. So in the MAD version, it's basically a 1:1 ratio of fat to protein, and you still have extremely low amounts of carbs, only about 10 to 20 grams per day. The reason for increasing the protein portion is because when you go on a ketogenic diet, it's actually very difficult to consume that much fat, especially for children. Then there's the legit, which I call legit, but it's low glycemic index treatment, which is really trying to up the amount of carbs. So we're going from the most strict, which is classic, to the least strict, which is the low glycemic index treatment. They all fall under the definition of a ketogenic diet. In the low glycemic index arm, you have about 40 to 60 grams of carbs going on. Now, as people do this, you'll hear all sorts of terms like ketone esters, ketone salts, medium chain triglycerides. And what the concept there is essentially you're adding the ketones into, let's say, your smoothie or your food or anything, so that you can actually get the benefits of a ketogenic diet without having to consume, let's say, a 4:1 ratio version. So it allows you to be able to cut down your fat a little bit by adding some ketone esters or medium chain triglycerides to it. Same thing when we talk about a plant-based diet. The definition of a plant-based diet is very, very variable depending on who you talk to. So the 4 sort of main categories is flexitarian, which most people when they're starting is where we want them to start, is as they make that shift, think about how can you slowly shift away from things like eggs and dairy and seafood and other stuff going on, but not having to be so drastic that you feel like you have given up so much that you can't. As you move down from that flexitarian, which means you have some of those things sometimes, then there's pescatarians, which is really limited to fish and a vegan diet. Vegetarian can be a lacto-ovo, which means it's dairy and it's eggs, or it can be lacto, or it can be ovo. And of course, vegan is no animal products whatsoever. Now, I want to make a distinction, and the distinction is as we talk about a whole foods plant-based diet, that's very different than a vegan diet. And the reason I say that is potato chips are vegan, but potato chips don't fall under a whole foods plant-based diet. So when you talk about this concept of minimally processed foods as close to their natural state, meaning closer to being whole foods, the more you shift towards that, the healthier you are. The more you go to things that are a lot more processed, the more likely you are to get into trouble. The challenge with nutrition always is we have this sort of black mark when it comes to nutritional studies that we don't have a lot of randomized controlled studies as being the gold standard. And if you can imagine, you can't really do a double-blind study because you're giving people food, so it makes it very hard. But what we're starting to see is we're starting to see some really, really exciting randomized controlled studies, including randomized placebo control, randomized in the sense that they're comparing one diet versus another. So let's talk about this first study, and then we'll go on to the second study with the Mediterranean arm. This first one was looking specifically at a low-fat, whole foods, minimally processed, plant-based diet against, once again, a minimally processed, animal-based ketogenic diet. And the key thing on this one is that they told the folks, you can eat however much you want to eat. So there was no restriction on the amount of calories anybody was eating. So that's really, really important. Now, before we get into what the methods and study and results and everything they found is, there are two common models that everyone talks about when it comes to weight gain, weight loss, diet, and etc. The first one is the carbohydrate insulin model. And by the way, the way it works is the ketogenic camp, if you're in that camp, they will cite the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. And if you're in the plant-based arm, you will cite the passive overconsumption of energy. But let's start out with the carbohydrate insulin model. And it goes something like this. The idea is as you eat more carbs, the carbs will cause an excess in insulin secretion. That's going to lead to excess in fat storage. We know that insulin, along with being one of the most anabolic hormones there is also a great way to shuttle all your extra calories into fat. So bodybuilders, for example, they inject a lot of insulin when they're really in their bulking cycles because they're trying to put on mass. And of course, they gain a lot of fat with it and then they lose it. So the idea is that as you go ahead and get excess insulin because of eating more carbs, you start to have more fat accumulation and you start to have increased amount of hunger and you feel fatigue and therefore you're not moving as much. Bottom line, the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity says you're going to become obese because you're eating more carbohydrates. So keep that in mind as we review this data, and let's look at this randomized study to see if that holds true. If you're in the opposite camp, which is the ketogenic arm, then the plant-based folks say there's this concept of the passive overconsumption of energy. And that idea goes something like this. It's basically that high-fat foods are going to actually have a lot more calories in a much more dense form. So you can look at, how many calories does it take for an 8 ounce of steak versus the same amount of kale, and the difference is quite drastic. So you have all of this energy that's dense, and because it's dense, what's going to happen is as it goes inside your stomach and it doesn't fill the stomach, it doesn't stretch the stomach, you're not going to feel full, and therefore you're going to end up over consuming the calories. So if this holds true, then everybody who goes on any type of high fat diet essentially should be gaining weight. So let's hold both of those ideas together and let's see what the data shows. So in this particular study, it's a very well designed study, and what they did was they had 2 weeks each. So if you were in the animal-based side, you started on a low-carb diet, which meant only 10% carbs, 75% fat, and whatever's left over is protein. Flip side was 75% carbs and only 10% fat if you were in plant-based. Here's what makes this study so good. The biggest issue that we have with most studies in nutrition is they don't define the quality of food. This is why studies, large studies such as the PURE trial, which said if you eat more carbs, you're going to die. The problem with those studies was they never defined what type of carbs. So in both of these cases, what they did was they made sure that the carbohydrate quality was very high, which means they were very low in ultra-processed foods. What's a classic example of an ultra-processed food? Donuts. And they also matched them for starchy vegetables. So in other words, both groups are getting a lot of starchy vegetables as well. non-starchy vegetables as well, so that from a calorie perspective, you're keeping the calories low. So it fits the keto arm, it fits the plant-based arm from a vegetable perspective, and you're making sure that the quality is high. So it's a little bit of a breakdown. Here it is. Average age was about 30 years old going on. Their body weight is variable, but it's really about 80 plus or minus 18 kilos going on. Now, they did have significant fat mass. In general, body fat was anywhere between 32%, give or take 12% going on top of that. And so what they did was they basically randomized them to either 14 days of a low carb, high fat diet first, and then they switched them to 14 days of a low fat diet, or they did the opposite. And what makes this study so good is, number one, it's really well controlled. They did daily body weights on them. They checked their vitals. They checked for beta hydroxybutyrate to make sure are they actually in ketosis going on. They were looking at activity by making them wear accelerometers and continuous glucose monitors to see how much sugar is changing throughout a 24-hour period, not just random measurements going on. And in addition to all of that, they made them spend 24 hours in a respiratory chamber so they could measure exactly how many calories they were burning. So based on all of that, it gives us a really good idea. Now, here's where it gets very, very interesting. Remember, the first part of the study that we talked about was you could eat whatever you wanted, however much you wanted. So what was interesting was that when you looked at how many calories in the low carb arm they were consuming, it was closer to about 2,700 going on. But if you looked at it the other way, and you looked at the low fat arm, once again, they could eat as much food as they wanted, except that it had to be very low in fat. In those arms, they were consuming about 700 calories less than the low carb diet. Now, the reason this is so substantial is if you look at essentially saying how much do you need to lose a pound, roughly about 3,500 calories net. What's net? It means that you need a deficit of 3,500 calories. You can do that either by cutting what you eat or by cutting what you eat, adding expenditure, meaning exercising, including the thermic effect of food and all sorts of other things going on. But what's fascinating is without changing anything, the people on a plant-based diet were already getting substantially lower calories going on. But that's not where the story ends. It gets more interesting. And where it gets more interesting is what happens to the hunger portion of people. So if you're thinking, wait a second, we talked about the carbohydrate insulin model in the beginning, saying that if you eat carbs, you're essentially going to get extra weight and become obese. Well, that wasn't necessarily true. In fact, in both of these arms, there wasn't any significant differences when it came to hunger, when it came to fullness going on, or when it came to eating capacity. So when we talked about the energy density model, which the concept was that if you ate high-fat foods, they're not filling the stomach, therefore you wouldn't feel full, or you wouldn't have satiety, and you wouldn't release ghrelin, you wouldn't shut down the release of ghrelin. All of those things didn't hold true. So neither the insulin carbohydrate model or this concept of passive overconsumption of energy held true in this study, because in both of them, they were able to follow it. Then let's get into weight loss. Who had better weight loss? Well, in this particular case, the low carb diet on day 14 had significantly more weight loss going on. In other studies that we've seen, in this particular one, if you had kept it going longer, you probably would have reached significance, but for 2 weeks, you didn't reach it. But what's fascinating is who was losing faster? It was actually the low carb diet. So now you're thinking to yourself, okay, that's all great. So maybe the ketogenic diet is ideal because I can get into that dress in 2 weeks. So let's keep going. The question you always have to ask is it just weight loss you're after, or is it health? So if it's just weight loss, then that's easy. We can starve you, right? We can go ahead and put duct tape on your lips and you don't eat anything, so you're going to lose weight. But here's where it gets interesting. Who was losing fat-free mass the most? Fat-free mass means that it has to be either water or muscle. So within those first 14 days, what they saw was that the low-carb arm actually lost more fat-free mass. On the flip side, when you looked at the low-carb diet versus the low-fat diet, it was the low-fat diet that actually had more fat loss. So if you're trying to break apart insulin resistance, if you're trying to become healthier, then a low-fat diet actually helps you to start losing more fat stores even from the very get-go. Now, the only downside is it's not as fast. But what's interesting about it is that without telling people they needed to restrict their calorie intake, telling them they can eat whatever they wanted, they already had close to 700 calorie deficit without making a physical change. But it gets more complicated. If you look at continuous glucose monitoring, this is where folks in the ketogenic arm will say, wait a second, I know that when I follow a ketogenic diet, my sugars are very, very low. And if I'm a diabetic, obviously my goal is to make my sugars very, very low. So why wouldn't I do that? Let's see what the data shows. So in this particular case, what they saw was that if you followed a low-fat diet, yeah, your sugar was actually higher than if you followed a low-carb diet. There's no doubt about it. That was true whether you looked at a continuous glucose monitor or you were just taking random samples after a meal to see how many minutes after and what was happening. And even if you looked at how much insulin was being released from the body, if you followed a low-fat diet, you had a bigger spike in insulin release versus if you followed a low-carb diet. So if you're watching all of this so far and you're listening and you're saying, wait a second, now I'm more confused than I was at the start of this talk. You have confused the heck out of me. Just tell me which one's better. In life, as you know, in medicine, there's a lot of gray, and you have to know these nuances. The reason it's so important is because when people follow a carb sort of deficit or a low carb, high fat diet, what happens is in as little as 1 to 2 weeks, they start to develop insulin resistance. That's really, really interesting. And what happens there is whenever they go, and a lot of people will do this, they'll say, well, doc, I'm going to go and have a cheat day. So once a week, I go eat whatever I want. The problem is, in the other studies that I've reviewed, it's so interesting that the lining of your endothelial cells, it breaks apart and you have all of these endothelial microparticles that get released because those cells literally die. And there's a beautiful study in Cell that documents this, where in as little as 7 to 10 days of following a low-carb diet, you already have insulin resistance. And then when you re-expose those people to a glucose-rich food, in this case was a 75-gram oral glucose tolerance test, all of a sudden, their body doesn't know how to react. So if you said, what is the worst diet in the world? The worst diet in the world is the yo-yo diet. It goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down, meaning that you can't really stick to. What is the healthiest diet that we know so far? It's in the spectrum of a whole foods plant-based diet. But the key word there is whole foods. So as part of our Southern California strategy that we're looking at is we want to be able to combine lifestyle medicine with medications, anti-obesity medications when it's appropriate, with bariatric surgery when it's appropriate, and have a comprehensive approach. But the lifestyle piece is plant focused, which means we push for people to consume more whole foods, more fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts, seeds, because of the fact that in the long run, you will do way better. So if you look at this data and you say, what can I take home? First, if you look at just fat-free weight loss, so meaning all you care is the scale looks better, then a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet will work. But keep in mind, you're looking at insulin resistance, other things like increase in uric acid. The high saturated fat content has been shown in study after study to be correlated, not causal, but correlation with worsening kidney disease going on. So forget about heart disease and everything, because I'm a nephrologist. I love the kidneys. There's 2 of them. It must be better than the heart. But from a kidney perspective, it really matters. So what we encourage people to do is to follow on the low-fat plant-based side, because when people actually follow a whole food diet, they will automatically start eating less calories. Their satiety is not affected. They have greater weight loss going on, and they don't see a difference in terms of things like hunger and so forth going on. So you want to know about all of this stuff and how that's changing. With that, the bottom line here is, 1, the carbohydrate insulin model, it doesn't hold true. Number 2, in terms of the passive overconsumption of energy model, That doesn't hold true either. But if you want to know what's healthier, is start to focus more on plants in your diet. That's not just my advice. The New American Heart Association guidelines that came out are also plant focused. Every single major organization is plant focused. If you're somebody who wants to go to the next level, you can join me. I'm plant-based, which means I try predominantly a plant-based diet with myself and my family. Now, let me go ahead and switch this over, and I want to show you the data on what happens when you then compare the same concept, but a plant-based diet to a Mediterranean type diet. And why should you know that data as you're talking about which is the ideal way that you want to sort of live your life? So let me play that real quick. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. Just give me one quick second. All right, perfect. So now you guys should be seeing the next slide, which is really the one that says Mediterranean versus low-fat vegan diet. In case you can't see it, if you could put that on the chat. So
we can see it, Dr. Hashmi.
Awesome, thank you very much. Okay, so with the Mediterranean versus low-fat, it was once again another really well-designed randomized control study. Mediterranean diet, what is it? It's predominantly a plant-based diet, but it also includes higher amounts of fat. So it's not a low-fat diet. People classically know it for olive oil, but don't forget it also has a lot of nuts in there. And they do eat meat, but they eat very little amounts of meat, and it's a lot more seafood. Predimed trial, love it or hate it. There's lots of fights over it because of the whole retraction that happened, and then they came back and said, no, it was still okay. But in terms of Predimed trial, it was the first one to really show how good a Mediterranean diet would be for reducing cardiovascular events. We talked about the vegan diet definition, so you guys have that already, which is really avoiding any animal products per se going on. So in this particular one, this was also a really well-designed study because it's a randomized crossover trial. So same people get to try both sides, 62 adults. Anytime you do a nutrition study, it gets into the millions going on. So you just want to know how expensive these studies are to do. And whenever we have a quality study, we want to make sure we talk about it. So in this particular case, it was for 16 weeks, 4 weeks of washout, and then they flipped the arms. So in the Mediterranean arm, what did they do? They followed them on the Predimed diet protocol. Vegan arm, same thing as before, 75% carbohydrates, 15% protein, and only 5% fat. They made sure that same thing, the quality of carbohydrates was very, very high. And they told them, eat whatever you want. However much you want, there's no restrictions going on. And they were not allowed to change any of their exercise stuff. So immediately, the first thing that was very interesting was, if you looked at the energy intake, everybody who follows a plant-based diet, they automatically reduce their energy intake without even knowing it. And that's one of the reasons why people start to see results and they start to lose weight and they start to think they're doing well. So on the vegan arm, they had about a 500 calorie drop here, close to 700 calorie drop in the other study that we talked about. Of course, in the Mediterranean arm, they had no change. But now that you understand the passive overconsumption model doesn't hold true, it's interesting to see that in the Mediterranean arm, where people are actually eating things like higher amounts of fats, they're not necessarily gaining weight on that, and their calorie counts aren't changing. They're not dropping, but they're not going up. On the fat side, of course, you expect higher amounts of monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids when it comes to intake in the Mediterranean arm. Carbohydrate arm, it's no surprise that the vegan arm is higher. Mediterranean, because they have more fat in it, you expect it to be low. But here's what's really, really interesting is when we look at things like fiber, fiber was substantially increased in the vegan arm versus the Mediterranean arm. So what did they find? Well, in the first 16 weeks, in the Mediterranean arm, they lost weight, about 3.5 pounds or so. But in the vegan arm, they lost 17 pounds. Remember, this is not a weight loss study. They were not told that they're asking them to lose weight. This is just switching from their baseline diet to this diet. And then in the second 16 weeks, what they saw over there was that in the folks that did the Mediterranean first, when they switched over to the vegan, they lost about 9 pounds. And those that switched from vegan to Mediterranean they ended up gaining about 3 pounds because of the higher fat content. When they looked at cholesterol in the Mediterranean arm, cholesterol went down a little, but specifically in the vegan arm, there was a substantial reduction in both total and LDL cholesterol going on. But on blood pressure, it was the opposite. The Mediterranean diet, because it's rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids, monos are interesting and conflicting because some of the early data in the 1990s and 2000s said having a diet rich in MUFAs would not affect blood pressure. In the 2010s till 2020, some of the data that came out then actually shows that diets that are rich in monounsaturated fatty acids would actually lower blood pressure. One of the most effective things for lowering blood pressure is a diet that's rich in potassium. That's both a Mediterranean and a whole foods plant-based diet. But what's interesting is that the blood pressure did go down in both without any intervention going on. So what you're really looking at in terms of the vegan diet is the fact that there's so much fiber in there. So when people look at the stool weight, they measure the stool, they burn the stool, they find that more of the energy that people are consuming is actually going out in the stool. And that's why if you talk to a person who follows a whole food plant-based diet, you'll never find somebody who's constipated. It's just a fact. And my GI colleagues at Woodland Hills, I always talk with them, and what they tell me is when they find people who are vegan, they usually, and this is anecdotal, but they usually find they have less polyps going on. And the second part is you add fiber, it's a prebiotic, you're increasing the thermic effect of food, and that makes a difference. So as you're looking at both of these studies and you're thinking about all of this data, the real take-home point here is this. If you want to know where is the thousands and thousands of studies out there, they all shift from red meat over to more plant-based diets, not any type of plant-based diet. Remember, I'm somebody who is anti the whole plant-based burgers and all those processed stuff that's coming out on the market. If you're really into plant-based burgers, go have a bowl of beans. That's way healthier for you to begin with. But don't look at shortcuts, because nowadays they put the label of vegan on just about everything. And just because it's vegan doesn't mean it's healthy for you. You're looking for foods that are minimally processed, that you're cooking at home, spending time at the dinner table, and getting a chance to spend it with your loved ones. That's why the nonprofit that I run, Self Principle, is about sleep, exercise, love, and food. Food is not the whole thing, but you want to be able to focus on all of these things going on. So last portion that I want to cover, and then I want to make sure that you guys get any and all of your questions answered, is just to talk about what is the opposite thing that you don't want to do. So we've talked about all of the things you do want to do, but what about the stuff that you want to make sure you really, really avoid as you're thinking about what would be the right ideal diet for you guys to follow? All right, and same thing, if for some reason you cannot see my slide and it's not being shared, just let me know in the chat and I'll make sure I fix it. But you should
see that.
Perfect, thank you. So in this one is just a real quick thing on what makes food addictive and what should you really know about that. We know that obesity is an epidemic. We know that food addiction is huge. In fact, if you had to ask how many people just in today's physicians who are highly intelligent, highly literate, all of that stuff, but how many of us have some degree of food addiction, those results would actually be shocking. We just don't label it as such, so we don't think about it. But how many times have we had a cookie and we say, yeah, I want another cookie? Those are all things because of the fact that there are some very, very common things that occur. As you continue to give people things that are really highly processed, so cookies, cakes, candies, etc., all that stuff, all it does is it stimulates. It's like TikTok, right? There's kids these days love TikTok, and you can get overstimulation because of the fact that every video is 15, 20 seconds, is designed to hit those quick dopamine receptors. And you start to have down regulation, which means your own life is no longer as exciting as some of the stuff that you're seeing. So what is really, really difficult is when they do these studies on mice, they'll find that if they give mice high refined carbohydrates with fat, if they stop feeding them and actually leave healthy chow inside their cages, the same mice will actually refuse to eat the chow. They will literally starve themselves to death because of the fact that they get so hooked on this idea of these high fat, high carbohydrates that are refined carb foods going on. So in this particular case, the Yale Food Addiction Scale is used very, very often, but essentially it's all about a validated questionnaire to kind of get an idea of what are the main components of food addiction and do you have it? So the thing that you want to know about addictive food characteristics is one, they are hardly in their natural state. This is why we say a whole food, minimally processed, plant-based diet. The other thing is they're always altered. And how are they altered? They increase the salt, they increase the sugar, and they increase the fat. I had a fascinating chance to talk with Michael Moss, who is amazing, amazing journalist, and he had a chance to go inside all of these companies like Nestle and so forth and talk to some of their senior folks around their own strategies on how they come up with a candy bar and all this stuff. And they're experts. They know exactly what our bliss point is. That's that point of maximal satisfaction. And what they know is salt, sugar, and fat. The three in one setting is the best way to get somebody hooked onto any product. Salt, sugar, combine it with fat. That's it. Those are literally the three ingredients that you want to have. And if you're somebody who says, look, I have a really hard time putting foods down, it's very simple. If you have it in the house, it's going to go inside your mouth. If you don't keep it in the house, you create barriers. You have to drive somewhere. It's harder. It's going to make it less likely that you're going to consume those foods going on. So as you think about all of this stuff, remember, the more concentrated stuff they have, the higher the risk. So what's a classic example of something that's really, really concentrated? It's all your zero sugar products. So people always tell me, they say, you know, why do you talk about stevia? Isn't that natural and comes from stevia glycosides and all that stuff, or Splenda or aspartame? Artificial sweeteners, which classifies stevia as part of them, they're anywhere between 200 to 26,000 times sweeter than sugar. So remember, concentrated dose, increased potency are the key ingredients that makes a substance very, very addictive. And in animal studies, when you give any of the rat models, if you give them water with any kind of artificial sweeteners, they will consume more of their food than if you gave them the actual sugary drink. So if you look at Coke and Diet Coke, which is going to make you eat more, it's actually Diet Coke. That doesn't mean Coke is not bad for you, but it's important to understand how deceptive it is to think that you're drinking something 0 calories, yet you can't lose weight because you keep stimulating at such a high level that strawberries no longer taste sweet anymore. So we all know this concept of glycemic index going on, and of course glycemic load is just taking into account the serving size for glycemic index. But what's fascinating about this is as you think about glycemic load, look at the left side, you got peanuts, you got watermelon, kidney beans, bran cereal, but on the right side, you got everything that you start to process. Right? How many people have heard about cornflakes? Cornflakes was brilliant marketing that helped us and duped us into thinking how important this concept of breakfast would be. And because of that, we started putting so much junk food. In fact, it's not breakfast that most Americans eat, it's dessert. In this study, what they did was they had some undergrads going on and they basically wanted to have them answer some questions, and they wanted to find out what are the foods that are the most problematic for them. And if you look at this list, think about those three things. Do they have salt? Check. Do they have sugar? Check. Do they have fat? Check. Are they highly refined? Check. Those are your most problematic foods. On the right side, the least problematic foods are just the opposite. They are very low in terms of refinement going on. They don't have any added salt, any added sugar, any added fats. So when you look at your own health journey and you say, what's the first step that I can do? First step is start to think about where are you getting highly processed foods. Whether they're plant-based or not, it doesn't make a difference. We know that an unhealthy plant-based diet is terrible for your kidneys, yet a healthy, whole foods, minimally processed, plant-based diet is the ideal diet for your kidneys. So in study 2 was similar, except for the fact that they were using a Likert scale. They just wanted to ask them, what is the likelihood that you're going to have issues? It's not a surprise that once again, the most processed foods, the highest in salt, sugar, and fat, are the ones that are going to be the most problematic. So if you're thinking about what to do as far as your own journey, your kids' journey, every time you guys sit down at a meal table, think about quality of food. Quality matters. You don't have to go down the road. If you're blessed enough to have money to buy things that are organic, good for you. If you can't, don't worry about it. Try to aim for more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, more nuts, more seeds, more legumes. All of those things are ideal for you. There's no such thing as perfection, and you don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. Good is good enough. So with that, I want to leave a few minutes for questions. I want to thank you guys and Dr. Tamadan very much for inviting me today. But with that, let me stop and answer any and all questions about these topics or any topics that you want to know related to nutrition, fitness, weight loss, anything.
Dr. Hashmi, first of all, thank you so much. That was outstanding. I'm so glad this is being recorded because I feel like I need to go back and relearn from this over and over again. That was really fantastic, Sean. Thank you. So there's two ways folks can ask questions. You can list your questions on the chat box, or you can raise your hand on Microsoft Teams and we will call on you. Let's see. Dr. Samolian, chief of our podiatry department, says, "What are you drinking?"
It's just my decaf coffee. That's it. You know, there's so much data on how good coffee is for you. It's amazing, especially when it comes to things like preventing kidney stones, which is fascinating. I'm just giving a lecture on that going on, preventing kidney disease in general, correlation, not causation. But the benefits are really 2 to 3 cups per day, decaf or caffeinated, and the benefits extend so far. So if you're sensitive to caffeine, just have decaf.
And Dr. Latanya Hines from our OBGYN department is asking what you think about eating nuts every day because they're known to be very dense in calories.
Yeah, so once again, when it comes to nuts, remember the passive overconsumption of energy model. That was what everybody talks about when it comes to nuts. The concept there is you're eating these calorie-dense foods. It's not going to be filling. You're going to eat too much and you're going to gain a lot of weight. That does not hold true in the randomized control study that I presented for you guys today, in other randomized studies that are going on that you should know about. So the answer is have nuts. I have a handful of almonds every single day. I think it's one of the best things you can do. Remember, the one warning I'll give you, all of you guys who are so incredibly bright and the future of SCPMG, a lot of us, what we're going to face is the risk of things like dementia. We're going to live a lot longer than most people. So what you want to focus on is not just a physical healthy body, but a healthy mind as well. So keep that in mind as you're making your choices every day.
Got it. Thank you. And then we have about 5 minutes left, Dr. Hashmi. So maybe we'll do a bullet form, a Q&A. How's that?
Okay.
Okay. Dr. Marta Vakulenko, chief of our cardiology department, says that Sean has food addiction need studies like drug addictions. What are some first steps to address it?
Yeah, with food addiction, it's very simple. Think about salt, sugar, and food. Those are the biggest things. Food addiction is real. That's why when patients come to us for bariatric surgery, if we don't address that and we let them go through, what happens is then they start blending their Big Macs. So obesity medications, what happens when we give somebody an obesity medication, we have a huge issue across the region with this, is we prescribe it, patients are still gaining weight. Why are they gaining weight? We didn't address the addiction. We just gave them another tool that gives them an excuse to say it's okay for me to have that extra serving.
Thank you. Dr. Jenna Liu from our psychiatry department is asking, what do you think of intermittent fasting, where you fast in the morning rather than in the afternoon?
Oh, I give tons of lectures and I practice it myself. The best version of it is time-restricted feeding. I have a whole lecture series on it, but I can tell you the data is fascinating. In fact, the best combination out there for weight loss is combining time-restricted feeding with a whole foods plant-based diet. And why time-restricted feeding? It's basically 8 hours of eating, 16 hours of fasting. Why? Because it's the only form of fasting that doesn't raise your ghrelin. Ghrelin makes you hungry. The 2 days a week of fasting, the 5 and 2, the fast mimicking diet, all of those things, they do the opposite. They make you more hungry. So the day after the fast, you end up overeating. The beauty of time-restricted feeding is you can actually make it a part of your life and do it with your circadian rhythm. When the sun is up, When the sun is down, stop eating.
Like our ancestors. Thank you, Dr. Ash. Dr. Pamela Diefenbach from Psychiatry is asking how to get CMEs. Dr. Diefenbach, if you scroll up on the chat box, you will see a site. It's in dark blue or in purple. If you click on it, if you hover over it, the little hand shows up. If you click on it, it will open the CME site so you can obtain your deserved CMEs. Dr. Chibar is asking, what is the best non-dairy creamer for coffee?
So the two best things, if you have kidney disease, for example, the best thing that we recommend is soy milk, unsweetened soy milk. The other one, if you're not worried about trying to increase your protein intake, you can look at almond milk. Those two are great. Things like oat milk, be careful because a lot of them have a lot of sugar in that. So just be mindful of the sugar content.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Chibar is from our rheumatology department. Dr. Jeffrey Mariano, chief of our GPCC department, is asking, how do you approach balancing the need for protein in building muscle to reverse age-related sarcopenia?
Yeah, so our healthy plate model, at the end of the day, it's 25% protein, it's 25% complex carbohydrates, and it's 50% fruits and veggies, with a ratio of 2/3 vegetables, 1/3 fruit. That's the healthy plate model. That's the same model that we have in Southern California Permanente. That's the same model that Canada has. Harvard decided to be a little bit unique and their ratios are off, but it's literally the same plate that everybody follows. That's plenty. You're going to get plenty of protein. If you need extra, there are options for things like plant-based proteins. Don't forget, tofu is awesome.
Wonderful. One of our pediatricians, Dr. Daniel Chu, is asking about how to address people's concern about whole food plant-based diets and the concerns around high protein intake to increase muscle mass.
Yeah, so there's a lot of bodybuilders nowadays who are getting plenty of protein, and I used to be a personal trainer back in the day, so I had a lot of clients that were going through different phases. But I can tell you, even if you're somebody who's following a whole foods plant-based diet, there's plenty of ways to get higher amounts of protein. There are protein powders that are plant-based, but I would highly, highly recommend not to go that route, simply because the cheap ones, when they process them, they have the highest concentration of lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic in plant-based proteins. So if you do get it, make sure it's organic, get reputable brands, because otherwise the processing is really, really bad for us.
Very good information. Thank you, Dr. Hashmi. Dr. Parekh, I believe your question was addressed about intermittent fasting. Dr. Ben Fass, again from our pediatrics department, does a plant-based diet reverse some renal compromise, decrease GFR, increase creatinine?
You know, it depends. If I had a book to sell, I would say absolutely yes, because I can make the GFR do whatever you want it to do, right? If I make you lose 20, 30 pounds, your GFR goes up. That's just a number. But in terms of slowing down, halting the progression of kidney disease, the answer is yes. And we have data from Japan that's been done that shows really, really good data on going all the way down to a 0.3 grams per kilogram per day with supplementation of essential amino acids to be able to slow that down, and they use plant-based proteins. So the answer is a plant-based diet is ideal. Second, phosphorus, which is really, really dangerous for the body, especially if you have kidney disease. Plants have 50% absorption in the human body versus anything that comes from animal sources. So if you want to know how to be able to lower your phosphorus, switch to a plant-based diet.
That's excellent. Thank you, Sean. Dr. Chad Kurokawa from our podiatry department is giving thumbs down to Big Mac, blended Big Mac. I agree with him. Dr. Sina is the chief of our hospitalists, and he's saying, can you please address the issue of hyperinsulinemia, regardless of its effect on weight in the whole food plant-based diet?
Yeah, so what's fascinating is when you look at hyperinsulinemia, it's not really hyperinsulinemia. In fact, if you look at the data going to a typical Western diet, which truly has insulin resistance, what you're getting away from is insulin resistance. So the insulin you secrete is far more effective. So in other words, the beauty of a whole foods plant-based diet, and if you combine that with time-restricted feeding, you see incredible results. I've had patients lose 150 to 200 pounds following this strategy, which, by the way, is equivalent to bariatric surgery and can beat it. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about this. It depends on how we put food in our mouth.
Wonderful. We are running out of time, and I want to be respectful of Dr. Hashmi's time, everyone else's time. I want to thank Dr. Neelam Pathikanda. Dr. Pathikanda, could you please come on video if you feel comfortable? We want to thank you for bringing such a great speaker to us. Dr. Hashmi, we learned so much from you, and I want to give the floor to Dr. Pathikanda to wrap up our session today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Tamadan. Thank you so much, Dr. Hashmi. It's great to be here, and it's so wonderful to be surrounded by such amazing brains at the Center for Healthy Living. Please definitely send your patients to us, to our plant-based diet class. It does answer some of these questions. Also, the pamphlet that we have around plant-based diet that KP has developed answers a lot of questions around protein in specific, or other kinds of how do we make sure that we get enough protein? How do we make sure we get enough B12, or what other issues you might have? So there's definitely some resources. If you still have questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you again, Dr. Pathikanda. And I see a couple more questions still about CME. If you scroll up, Dr. Megan and others, if you scroll up on the chat box, there's a couple of opportunities to click on the CME link, and it will open up the website for the CMEs. Again, thanks everyone for joining us. We will see you next Tuesday at our weekly Tuesday meeting. Have a wonderful rest of the week.